morning to you all. I hope you have a great day. And we're going to start by giving the floor to the next speaker, Dr. Elena Marañón Maison. She holds a chair on technologies in the environment, University of Oviedo. Title of her presentation: Advances, Difficulties and Challenges in the Environmental Protection. She will have 20 minutes for her presentation, approximately, and then we'll have some time for Q&A for another 30 minutes. I will now first give the floor to another gentleman, Mr. Ignacio García Arango Cienfuegos Jovellanos, President of the Foundation Foro Jovellanos from the Principality of Asturias. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for attending the Good morning to you all. I'm going to be very brief. I am not an expert on bioethics, and I have always been devoted to other fields of actions, but I am good for chairing. What I would like to say, if you don't mind, is to ask brief questions so that Elena has more time to answer you, and because Elena is also a very synthetic person, she will also like it, no? If you ask brief questions, short questions. And I will now give the floor to Elena. Good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to participate in this forum, in this Congress, and I can see that there are many young people here in the room, which agrees with the topic of this 10th Congress, International Congress on Bioethics, Youth and the Environment. And the future is in your hands, and you will also be responsible for the improvement of the planet, the modification of behaviors and habits we have acquired as a consequence of development exclusively based on economic advance and profit. And of course, now we are realizing that this cannot go on longer. We have been reflecting upon this topic for some years, and we need a change. But it is in your hands mainly. Of course, in our hands as well, but it is you, youngsters, who have a lot to do and a lot to say now and in the near and longer future. I'll try to stick to 20, 25 minutes, 30 minutes even, if they allow me. When they contacted me to give a presentation at the Congress on Bioethics, I thought, oh my God, I was taken aback, because my professional career has always been linked to 3 years that I have been working for the Principality of Asturias. However, since I started and when I did my PhD work, I studied the treatment of wastewater, so my interest has always been in the environment. My initial training was on chemistry, but when I studied, and I'm going back to the 70s, bioethics did not exist in the curriculum. We only had some subjects that could cover these environmental topics.
Y bueno, pues hice la tesis doctoral.
So I did my PhD work, and then I worked as a professor and then as a chair for the environment and technology.
El índice de la exposición
This is the index of my presentation, the different items I'm going to be touching upon. I'm sure some of these topics are not new. First, the main events that were the landmark or the basis for the posterior struggle against the environmental deterioration. They were also the basis to elaborate policies to fight against the environmental deterioration, the tools that we have to fight against the environmental deterioration, and then some challenges ahead of us, and that we will have to face to build up a sustainable future.
Que no se consigan igual los objetivos. El camino hacia
the advance and the way towards a minimum level of environmental impact is unstoppable. Maybe where there is a greater delay is the deadlines. We want things to happen now, here and now, and that is not simple. The environmental deterioration is a consequence of the increase in population with a greater consumption rate of resources, and we are consuming at a greater pace than nature can undertake. So we are consuming beyond our limits of possibilities. And as a consequence, we are emitting pollutants in a volume above the absorption rate by nature. Nature has a specific capacity of absorption. We should be emitting all these pollutants in a much more controlled way without overcoming the capacity of regeneration. Environmental issues may be local, but they are global because there is an interconnection between what we are throwing into the atmosphere. Then we have the acid rain, then that may fall onto the soil, the planet, the floor. So there is an interconnection between the physical medium and the other environments, and also the other activities involved, human activities, industrial activities, and of all kind. Primary sector, farming, agriculture, heavy industry, so on and so forth. Many players involved. As I mentioned, effects may be global because contamination or pollution is global. Climate change, greenhouse effect gases, reduction of ozone layer, acidification of the waters, the soils, acid rain, biosphere, contamination with different kind of pollutants or toxic compounds, loss of biodiversity, and many species disappear. Local scale, due to emissions of nitrogen oxides, for example, or other particles. I'd like to highlight at this point something that you may not know, and there is some confusion as well. And this takes me to say how important training and good information is. Training with rigor. Not any training is good. There are many fake news out there, and unfortunately they are proliferating. And whoever is reading a paper or on the website, that person doesn't know whether that is true or not. You need some criteria or some kind of training to be able to judge whether that piece of news is or not true. Ozone. I have read many stupid things about the ozone and much nonsense. The high layers 10,000 to 1,000 kilometers away have nothing to do with the lower layers. The ozone up there is necessary because it will block ultraviolet radiations, and it should be there, that ozone layer, so far away. But that has nothing to do with the ozone being produced as a consequence of other pollutants, nitrogen oxides, and organic substances with the subsequent reactions, photochemical reactions mainly. And that is a problem. The excess of ozone is a problem, but on a lower level, at the level we breathe. Then on a local level, we have different particles, hydrocarbons, heavy metals, particles, toxic effects, therefore. Food is beneficial, but if you eat too much, then you will get sick. Well, with the nutrients, the same happens. Nutrients are beneficial, but excess in nutrients will lead to a generalized problem called eutrophication. Excess of seaweeds, deterioration of organic matter, so on and so forth. So that is a problem as well. Some natural elements disappear, some green areas already disappear as well. In the urban area, but also in the rural area, there are some of these problems because it is the depopulation is a fact, and traditional practices are being lost in terms of agriculture and farming. And the result is, again, more and more problems, because to satisfy a greater demand of food by the population, many fertilizers are being used, excess of nutrients, many pesticides. These substances stay there. Biodegradation is not easy. And in the natural environment, well, there is an extraction of resources. I don't know whether you attended the session yesterday, but yesterday a lot was said about climate change. That is one of the global relevant problems as a consequence of the increase in CO2 emissions. But not only CO2, there are many other gases. CO2 has 81% of contribution to greenhouse effects. But there is methane, CH4, N2O, and other gases that have a high potential of greenhouse effect. However, the rate is lower than CO2, and that is why everybody mentions or comments on CO2 and not the others. But others should also be borne in mind. Here we see the relationship between CO2 concentration to population rise, and also increase in temperature in the planet. Another important problem I like to pinpoint is the problem of traffic. Traffic jams. Traffic also sends other particles, toxic particles, into the atmosphere, and that leads to pollution, photochemical pollution, which are bad for us, for human beings, because we're breathing that, and among them we have the ozone. Here you have some data. 7 million of people die every year due to the exposure to fine particles in polluted air. 90% of these deaths related to air pollution occur in countries with low or mid-income, and around 40% of the worldwide population, 3,000 million people, do not have access to fuels or clean kitchen technologies, for example, or clean fuel. And that is a problem, and that leads to premature deaths due to the pollution or contamination in the households. Water pollution, again, many problems due to dumping. Waters that have not been well depurated, and this leads to sanitary problems by microorganisms, and then eutrophication, excess of nutrients. When we refer to industrial wastewaters, we also have those problems: toxicity due to heavy metals, persistent organic substances, hydrocarbons, or we can also talk about diffuse pollution, farming, agriculture. What I mentioned before is focused pollution through waste. But, as I said, there is another important pollution, what we call diffuse pollution. There is not just one focus, just one pipeline to dump the waste. No, it is happens as a consequence of rainwaters. Farming, agriculture, plots, that water solves substances. And then this goes to the sea, to the oceans, after going through the runoffs. Later on, I will also talk briefly about the plastics. Now some plans are being implemented to reduce plastic presence worldwide. We also have problems regarding scarcity of this element. Some people who do not have access to water, or some people who are consuming water, they do have water, they consume water, but it has not been depurated or cleaned, and therefore this water is intoxicated, and around 2,000 kids die every day due to the bad quality of this water. As for plastics, well, you know that around 8 million of tons of plastics get to the ocean. I cannot talk longer about this because I only have 20 minutes, but anyway, lots of plastic in the oceans. It is biodegradable. It takes a lot of time for them to degrade, and they float, and then the wind moves this plastic away from one place to another, and then they end up making up what we call plastic isles. There is an accumulation of solid wastes as well in dumping sites. In the dumping sites, we have many of these solid wastes. But although they are being quite well managed, the landfills, there are very many, too many, and that is another serious problem, that of the management of solid waste. And remember that we have a very strict legal framework, and we have some recycling that has to be done and improved. to reduce the amount of solid waste. What about the events that laid the foundation for the fight against the environmental deterioration? Very briefly, in the 60s, there was hardly any legislation framework related to environmental protection. There were no norms, no laws, and that is when the scientific community started to send alerts to the population worldwide about the poverty, loss of biodiversity, and environmental deterioration. The Rome Club was set up in 1968. Different scientists, experts, politicians, diplomats met because they had to stop this bad development. It was understood that we were coming from a situation of war, not a world war, and people just had to eat and produce, and that was the main concern. And therefore, quality of life in that first phase, the first 50 years after the war, in the aftermath of the war, was not the environment. And then the Rome Club was outstanding. And then in 1970, the United Nations declared 1970 as the year of protection of nature. Conference of Stockholm was the first of the so-called summits of the Earth. It was held in 1972. Many declarations were drafted, 26 principles, an action plan with 109 recommendations. And some of the specific targets were defined. Program UNEP was also elaborated to fight against environmental deterioration, a very relevant program. Many nations have endorsed it. In 1983, the World Commission on Environment and Development was set up. The Brundtland report that comes from the former Norwegian First Minister, Brundtland, Miss Brundtland, who had also been Minister for the Environment, and she was appointed to lead a group and study this problem. She did not want to, at the beginning, to be in charge. She thought it was a demanding commitment, but then Ban Ki-moon said it had to be her leading this group because she fulfilled many requisites, because she had been responsible for environmental issues in her country. She had been the first woman holding the position of a minister. So she accepted the position, and then the result of it all was the drafting of the Brundtland report, and the term of sustainable development was coined. Then in 1992, another landmark was the summit of Rio de Janeiro. 3 agreements and 2 legal tools were passed with a great impact. The Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity, also Agenda 21, with some measures to reach sustainable development, protection of forests, so on and so forth. The other summits from then on were not so important or not so much taken into account. There were some extraordinary meetings. We have the one in 1997, the one in South Africa, another one in Rio in 2012. And 20 years after that in Rio, that in Johannesburg, sorry, correction by speaker, another one in Rio was held. Many heads of state did not turn up, however, so it was not that important. I have included here 2 quotes by Ban Ki-moon in the official opening. Says the efforts of the countries have not been at the level of the challenge, and then another sentence that there is nature does not negotiate with human beings.
This is more recent, in 2015, which was the summit of New York. Here, a new Sustainable Development Agenda was adopted for the next 15 years, Agenda 2030. There are a series of objectives, principles, and here we can see 3 main objectives: to bring an end to extreme poverty, combat inequality and injustice, and gender all sorts of injustices, and redress or repair climate change. These were the events that have acted as a basis. Now we're going to have a look at the instruments that we are using to make progress in combating the deterioration of the environment. I've classified them or divided them into 4 types. I'm going to comment a few of them briefly, what I've got time for. Regulatory instruments. Because if we are not forced to do something, we don't do anything. That's true of anything. We have to be forced to do things. They have to set limits to this activity, to this contamination. We have to reach 50% recycling of solid urban waste before a certain date. But sometimes we don't reach those deadlines, although we do in the end reach the goal. There's been a lot of influence in the improvement of the environment, and we have all sorts of regulatory instruments. Some are voluntary, some are compulsory, mandatory. The European Union, the directives, the decisions are mandatory. And then we have the differences between the directive and a regulation is normally a deadline. Of course, they can also be voluntary. These include recommendations, standards, rules that aren't compulsory but are recommended to improve the environment activities. We have ISO, the EN, the UNE standards, and in addition to agreements, protocols that are binding for the signatories and therefore are mandatory. Then we have technical instruments that encompass all technologies used to preserve the environment, both prevention that prevents the generation of waste or less toxic pollutants, that all of that is an improvement. And also we have corrective technologies that correct the contamination. For example, if we're emitting particles through a gas, we have filtering systems for them to be retained so that the particles don't get into the air. We also have economic and fiscal instruments, all sorts of aid, subventions to help combat pollution, reduce it, improve our processes, etc. And also taxes, the rates, taxes placed on the accumulation of waste. These are all instruments that are being considered. Green taxes, taxation, And of course, there are what I have called social instruments. Training, educational activities, awareness-raising activities, which are carried out at the different educational levels, from primary up to university. Training, educating in the media is also important because they often produce news that is rigorous and correct, but then again we have the fake news that harm the population because they really don't know what is fake and what is true. In regulatory instruments, going into a bit more detail now, how long have they been ongoing? No, my time's nearly up. So what I'm going to do then is skip this. I've said before that there are a lot, both in the field of prevention, and water, air and waste. There's a lot, but I'm going to skip this and go to the end of my presentation. This where the regulations started to come out when we saw in the 70s the deterioration of the environment. So started in the 70s, 80s, 90s. In Spain, we followed at the same time, more or less. In 86, the Europeans said that we had to adapt to the European regulation. You can see this on my presentation. In the regulation, there was a lot. First of all, they compiled all the different regulation. There's an awful lot of regulations, but if you go into the websites of the different organizations, the Ministry of the Environment or the website of the European Union or the US, you can have a look at the different regulations referring to air, water and waste. As I've said before, there's an awful lot. Here there was some data about the importance of transport, electricity, contribution by gases, instruments to be able to comply with the Kyoto Protocol, voluntary instruments. Here we had a chart where we can see how each country contributes, the annual emissions of CO2 per country. Here we can see tons per inhabitant per year. The US, for example, is over 15. They're very unequal. And we can see how, in general, there are countries such as China. In the 70s, for example, their economy was agriculturally based, and they had the emissions per inhabitant were very low. But now this is decreasing. The Paris Agreement, other conventions, volatile organic components. There's all sorts of regulations. The basic European regulation of water, on the quality of water as well, which sets some quality objectives for certain pollutants and also establishes monitoring. Because the only way to see if these directives or regulations are being complied with is to monitor them. Here with waste, we can see the different directives. And the final one, the third one you can see on the screen, is related to the light plastic bags. At the end of the year, they said that plastic bags couldn't be used in businesses. Only 30% of the plastics are recycled now. Some of the plastics are exported. Before they were exported mainly to China, but China has now refused to receive them. So now there are other countries, because this breaches a basic principle. It's the polluter pays, for example, principle. And then we have also the proximity principle that says we have to treat our waste at facilities that are closer to where they are produced. Now with the transport as well, there's a lot of CO2 emissions which are very contaminating. The single-use plastic bags that are going to be restricted and then will disappear. And then another series of products made of plastic are going to disappear. This is now being legislated, a series. The first of all are the cotton buds, for example. Cotton buds, people don't know that the cotton buds are going to be forbidden and they can't be thrown down the toilet, because in the treatment plants they cause a lot of problems. This is something that people don't know, the same as the wet wipes that can't be thrown down the toilet either. And people really ignore all of this. So we have a lot to do to raise awareness about that. There's another regulation. Elena? There is another regulation, and with that I'll finish, on prevention. The prior assessment wasn't made to see what product was the least contaminating. The companies implement these quality procedures now in the country. In the different companies, they establish standards to assess their environmental behavior. And finally, with challenges, we have a lot of challenges. Doing this, it's difficult to sum up all of this. We have to advance towards decarbonization. Less contaminating products, less contaminating vehicles. Urban mobility plans are essential, absolutely essential. There are loads of examples of all of this. We've got examples of sustainable cities. The least mobility possible. In Copenhagen, 50% of the population use a bicycle or walk to work. In short, in water, we have to save water and try to regenerate water, because we have to process or treat the water. If we apply more processing, we can reuse the water. And with the water scarcity, this is an important challenge to be taken into account. And regarding waste, we have to improve the separation. Organic material should be separated. In 2020 we should reach 50%, and we are now just slightly above 20%, and 2020 is just round the corner. And of course we have to foster what we call the circular economy, and that means reusing and hierarchization in management of waste, prevent, reuse, recycle, recover, and finally go to the dumping site. The last Saturday was the World Cleanup Day. These are all actions, civic actions that are not, if you've had a party, leave all the rubbish. All the young people can have fun, but they mustn't leave their rubbish. And here, this is the first machine that is used to clean up the plastic. This engineering student, 19 years old, saw how... Please finish. You've gone way over your time. We can talk about all of this. We have no time for our debates. It is very difficult to sum all of this up.
Gracias, Elena.
Thank you, Elena. We're going to have a very brief debate, Q&A session. Elena has given you a master class, and I don't understand very much about the environment and ethics, but I would like to add something. You are very young and I'm very old, but we all have to do something to leave a better world for our children. You have the challenge of living in a world that is full, a first world where there's a lot of waste, and then there's a third world which is just the opposite. Borrell was asked what socialism is some time ago. He said 10 words. Socialism for me is a passion, a love for others, and ethics is passion and love for others too. Others including humans, animals, plants, minerals, water, etc. And having said that, you can ask what you want now. You can ask any questions you want now. We've got a few minutes left. Over there. Can you give your name? Well, that is, if you want. Good morning. I'm from the School of La Coruña. Thank you very much, Elena, for your presentation. I think you would have more, if you had more time, you would have illustrated us a bit more. I would really like to thank you for the presentation, but I would like you to explain a little bit more about the initiative of Boyan Slat, this 19-year-old boy that decided to carry out this young man was diving in the sea in the Greek islands one summer, and he saw how there were more plastic than fish. So he was a first-year student of aeronautical engineering, and he started to think how he could attack this problem. And in the end, what he did was left his studies, and he devoted his time to this project. He is a pioneer in this. The aim of the project was to eliminate or to move the plastics. and accumulate the plastic in a place, observe the currents, and place some floating barriers which are secured to the seabed, and depending on the current, retain the waste. And afterwards, the waste was transferred to platforms and then on to dry land. How did he manage this? Well, at 19 years old, it's a serious problem. He was concerned with the environment, but he persevered. That is something we have to acknowledge. He managed, I think it was 1.9 million euros using crowdfunding. And then he managed to get others to fund the project to carry out this first installation facility, and it started working not very long ago. It's located between Hawaii and California, where we can see the greatest accumulation of plastic. He is now 24 years old, and he founded or created the company, which I think is about 60 workers, and we hope it will be successful, and I'm sure it will. Any more questions? No? No, and no. I think there's one at the back. Hello, good morning. Congratulations, Elena. I'm a doctor, and we from Asturias are very concerned with the contamination of the air, of water. I know you know a lot about that, and you now hold a responsible job in politics. Everything that is happening in the air in Gijón, and we doctors see the result of all of that with breathing disorders and others that we don't know about because they don't carry out sufficient studies. How do you address when you hear things in the news saying that the City Council of Gijón recommends not going out into the street to do exercise, and this is what we called a natural paradise, and this recommendation is due to the air pollution, environmental pollution. I don't know if this was the fake news as well, and also what is happening in the San Lorenzo beach, the lack of treatment of the water, and many other things too. Is there any sort of resistance on behalf of the large companies, the steel works, etc., based on your experience, that is? Even if it's only done by fines or recommendations, is there any sort of censorship in this topic? A very interesting question. As I've said, based on my experience, I'm going to explain this as best I can. The quality of our air is not bad, in fact. With respect to Gijón, it is true, it's at the higher area, the western area. We do have some problems. We have higher levels of particles in suspension. as a result of the industrial activity that exists in that area. How can we address this? Well, the administration has drafted plans, approving improvement plans of air quality. The first were approved in 2014 with a series of measures. I'm not going to say they have been complied with 100%, but a lot of the measures have been very high economic costs, some of them, and some are more simpler, that can be addressed better. Many measures have been implemented in the port area with screens, using surfactants, etc. So the particles aren't drawn away when it's windy. Our meetings are with the people responsible are continuous because we have to try to improve the water treatment plants as well. And there is now a plan of action investing in the environment. And now we have a more ambitious plan for investments that is being carried out now for the past year, and which will end at the end of this year, beginning of next year, really until 2022. A calendar of actions that are going to be implemented and to implement improvements in the water treatment plant and in the practices. Some of the pollution is non-point source pollution, which can be improved. This, of course, takes time, it takes investments, and the investments have to be approved by the company. And logically, there are opinions, interests for everybody, because there are jobs at stake. And now, as we are moving towards a reduction in the use of carbon or thermal energy, and we have to do this with an adequate program. This program must also be feasible, viable, because the other option, what would the other option be? Close down the company. That isn't feasible. But I insist those plans are now ongoing, new plans, that is, improvement plans. And what else the other question is how you can, Asturias, natural paradise, how is that compatible when being asked to stay indoors? These are really very few days. You've got the pollution from industry, from cars, every day of the year. But the weather conditions often make it difficult to disperse those pollutants. They are suspended, they aren't dispersed. Of course, vertically, because the weather conditions affect this. And they remain there suspended, and that means that the levels rise. And when that occurs, we have a protocol in place. The protocol, there was a protocol some time ago, but another one has been approved this summer with new measures to recommend the not using the cars, bringing down the prices, and this all depends on the councils to see how the transport public works. but the reduction of 20–40% in the prices of bus tickets to promote public transport has been recommended. Using public transport as much as possible on those days, and the sensitive people, those who have asthma, allergies, older people, children, try not to do exercise outdoors because their breathing can be affected. We don't want to alarm. It is for prevention alone. It is true that when the levels rise, on those days, people go to the doctors more. People with breathing problems, asthma, etc. I don't know if there's anything else you asked. Thank you, Elena. I was thinking of another question, but we haven't got time for that because at 11 o'clock the next ones have to start. Thank you, Elena, for your presentation. I'd like to thank all of you too. And I'm going to give Eva a few minutes. Thank you for coming here to this 10th World Conference on Bioethics. Thank you for attending. Thank you for collaborating. And the debate on Dr. Marañón's presentation. And that's all for the moment. I hope you have a good day.